co-sponsored with the Department of Economics, and I'd like to thank the department and Professor Soren Hauge for their excellent cooperation in setting up the event. As always, I encourage you to connect with the CPP on social media by liking us on Facebook and following us on Twitter at Center for Politics. Immigration policy is an issue that is certainly a central debate in America today, and as an immigrant myself, I'm certainly highly interested in it. When we look at the history of immigration law and policy, the last really major standalone U.S. immigration reform bill that became law was the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And you might say, how long ago was that? In fact, I looked into it. It was 12,019 days ago. That was November 6, 1986. That is a long time. Since then, we've had a couple of reform bills, but those were primarily based on modifications of an even older law, namely the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. So it's been a really long time since we have really had major immigration reform bills coming before Congress and passing. That's the most important issue, of course. There are two other quick observations I'd like to make. One is, when we think about immigration, many people have a certain category of immigrants in mind, right? But generally speaking, we think of immigrants in four different categories, so to speak, right? Immigrants who have become citizens. Then, of course, we have legal and conditional residents, often those who have green card status. And then, of course, we also have temporary immigrants. And you might think of, there are over 20 different visa categories, and many of them actually eventually become residents and maybe citizens, but it's certainly a separate category. And then, of course, we have undocumented immigrants as well. The other observation I would make is when it comes to permanent immigration, that is green card holders, roughly 2/3 of them, and that's true for pretty much every single year, of them come here based on their family-based or family-based categories, right? So 2/3 come here through family-based categories. That is a high number, and I think that's one of the things that we can certainly discuss today and into the future in terms of what should that mix be between family-based immigration and employment-based immigration, that is sort of merit-based immigration. Professor Hauge will now introduce our speaker, Dr. Hunt.
We're very happy to have Dr. Hunt here addressing this issue. Dr. Hunt is the James Collins Chair in Economics and Professor of Economics at Rutgers University. From 2013 to 2015, while on leave from Rutgers, she served as the Chief Economist of the U.S. Department of Labor, then as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Microeconomic Analysis at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Prior to joining Rutgers in 2011, she held positions at McGill University, University of Montreal, and Yale University. Dr. Hunt is a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research in London, England. Her current research focuses on immigration and wage inequality, while past research has also encompassed unemployment, the science and engineering workforce, the transition from communism, crime, and corruption. She's published research most closely related to this topic in Science, in the Journal of Human Resources, the Journal of Labor Economics, the American Economic Journal, Macroeconomics, and the Canadian Journal of Economics, among other places. So we're very happy to have a person whose work is receiving such attention in the field here. Dr. Hunt received her doctorate in economics from Harvard and her bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Please welcome Dr. Hunt.
Well, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm going to talk about what the best immigration policy might be. And I'm going to touch on various aspects of that. And the first thing that you need to ask is, well, when you're talking about the best immigration policy, the best policy for who? So are we talking about the whole world, the best policy for the world? going to show you a few more photos, most of which I took myself. I didn't take this one myself. Or are we talking about the best immigration policy for the United States? Even within that, are we talking about the best policy for firms? Are we talking about the best policies for workers? Are we talking about the best policies for immigrants or potential immigrants? Are we talking about the best policy for the native-born Americans? Are we talking about the best policy for the poorest people in the world? Or are we perhaps even talking about the best policy for the most frightened people in the world? And even once we've sort of decided these things, we might need to do some prioritizing amongst the categories and think about, does a country have particular obligations to its neighbors, and who are its neighbors? So these are some of the particular routes that immigrants use to get to Europe, either to lodge asylum applications or to work in the underground economy. Does Europe, for example, have particular obligations to North Africans or to people who manage to get to their borders? And so the point of all of this is to say that actually what the best immigration policy is a subjective matter. And so the short summary of the talk is that I can't tell you what the best immigration policy is, because everyone can have a different valid view on what that is. And what it's going to depend on, amongst other things, but it's going to depend on what weight you place on different people in the world. And you could boil it down to who would we, if we have $1, who would we like to give that extra dollar to? Now, strictly speaking, we're trying to make people happy. The US Constitution says so, rather than rich, but it's a lot easier to measure how rich people are than how happy they are. It's also easier to make people rich than happy, I think. So let's boil it down, as economists perhaps a little too often do, to dollars, and recognize here the importance of what you can call a social welfare function, which is just something that allocates weights to indicating how much you care about people. So economists are sometimes disparaged unfairly in my view, but on the other hand, I've also seen the opposite. Some people place a lot of confidence in economists that's somewhat misplaced. So let me tell you what I think economists can and cannot tell you about what the best policy is. I've already told you one thing we can't tell you. We can't tell you what weight you should place on different welfare of different people. But going beyond that, well, we have a bit of a tendency, and this is a confession rather than a boast, we have a bit of a tendency to weight people equally just because that's easy. And so, in a lot but not all of economics, what we do is just say, all right, we care about people equally, and so we don't really care who we give that extra dollar to, and if we're working out how well off people are, we just calculate how much each group is earning, we sum that all up, and we use that as our measure of how well an economy or a group of people are doing. And we do that purely because it's easy, not necessarily because it's good. And therefore, we talk a lot about the total size of the pie in some situation, and how different policies will affect the total size, the total size of the economic pie. And so we can talk about what policies maximize the pie. So I've implicitly put weights on people, it's all equal. But this does allow us economists to say some things. And it's actually clear to economists that focusing on economic issues, if you're interested in the total size of the pie, the best policy is free mobility, free migration. Everyone can move wherever they want. So that everyone moves to their best opportunity, and they will be most productive there, and that will maximize the productivity and the total pie in the whole world, but not only actually the whole world, but also, since we're in the US, the size of the American economy would also be maximized by free mobility. Furthermore, the size of the rest of the world pie would also be, although I should say the rest of the world as defined now. So suppose we open things up to free mobility now, that would be the best for the people currently living outside the US, not necessarily for that place after everyone has moved. And free mobility also maximizes the size of the native pie, so that's maybe a little bit more interesting because those people are not changed by allowing free mobility. But even if no Americans emigrate, and some would like to maximize their own opportunities, the total amount of economic resources going to people born in the US is maximized by people allowing however many people want to move to the US or indeed out of the US. Okay, so probably you don't hear many people saying this. So what might be the niche? There are a couple of little flaws in this when you take it to the real world, even looking only at economics, and I'm mostly only going to talk about economics today, not political aspects. And one is that this result that everything would be the best if everyone moved wherever they wanted to, it does assume in that world governments don't give anything to people in terms of transfers or welfare programs. And so if you allow for that, that's going to change a little bit where people move to compared to the efficient allocation, because welfare programs are not about efficiency, they're about redistribution and other considerations that we're actually going to come to shortly. But that does mean you won't have the optimal allocations if different countries have different levels of welfare programs, which of course they do. Now, you could get around that though by simply saying that immigrants don't get any welfare. So some people don't like that, but it's certainly possible to do that. In fact, even in the US, we have a partial program like that. So there are a lot of benefits that you only get after you've been on a green card for 5 years, for example. In Britain, for example, at least until Britain leaves the European Union, whenever that might be, there's free mobility within the EU, so anyone from the EU can move to Britain. But if you move from outside the EU, even if you have a visa, you don't actually get a lot of the benefits from the government. And a different thing that you could do rather than just excluding immigrants for benefits would be to say you have to pay a special tax, you have to pay insure yourself essentially actually against using the benefits in a way beyond what natives do. So what's the other hitch? So it's clear that the size of various pies is maximized by letting people move freely. But that does imply that there are going to be not only winners, but also losers. So it's not what we call in economics Pareto improving policy. No policy change that you can make is Pareto improving. There's always winners and losers. I noticed when I worked in government, there's a very big demand for Pareto improving policies where there will be no losers, but unfortunately, there really are no such policies. They only differ in terms of how much you like the losers. So, all right, I probably don't need to say that nobody is in favor, not nobody, but that free mobility, free migration, open borders is not on the policy table at the moment. And so what can economists say after it's taken off the table? So this gets more difficult because the short answer is a lot less than some people think or would like. So theory, it doesn't give us an ideal, an optimal number of immigrants after you've closed off the first best solution, which is free mobility, or first best solution under some assumptions. But there aren't any, even with assumptions, we don't get any optimal number once we've taken off the free mobility from the table. So what could economists do? Well, if you hand me two different specific policy proposals, then with some difficulty and some approximation, I could do some sort of simulation and compare them, and perhaps say, well, if you're most worried about this group, or you like, or these winners are most important, then perhaps you'll prefer this scenario, and otherwise you'll prefer the other scenario. Although even that would be rather difficult, and even that, probably more realistically, would be only looking at the size of the pie, perhaps not that new distribution that I just mentioned. So because we'd have to decide these weights again, how much do we weight firms versus workers, which type of workers do we care about. So even those simulations and comparing specific scenarios are rather different. And so this came up, the first big project I worked on when I went to work in the Obama administration was a big push at the beginning of 2013 for immigration reform. And obviously free mobility was not one of the options being considered, and I was in a group of economists and other quantitative people that sort of more politically oriented people would ask questions of, and a couple of things that they asked us were, what is the optimal number of H-1B visas, and how could you design the H-2B visa program so that you would adjust the number of visas available to the state of the economy? And the really short answer to both of those questions is no idea. But that obviously was not the right answer when you're working in policy. But really, theory just doesn't guide us when you've got these specific programs and specific constraints, and it's not really an answer to either of those questions, although it was kind of fun to try to think about the second question. Because still, theory sort of says the right number is the number of people who want to come. If the economy goes badly, fewer H-2B visas, or fewer people will want to come on H-2B visas. So what can we contribute after free mobility is off the table? Well, one thing is that we can help you understand the mechanisms through which the economy responds to immigration. Although if that doesn't help us to decide the optimal number, it's not totally clear how it would help non-economists decide on the optimal number. But I still think it would be a guide. And we can explain, and this would be not so much based on theory, but based on the data, given past immigration policies, who have been the winners and the losers. And this is sort of a preview of the conclusion. In my view, if economists were advising policymakers ignoring the political factors based purely on economic factors, we would recommend increased immigration, particularly in the US, which I'll show you a graph later, is actually only a moderate immigration country. However, at the same time, recognizing that there are losers, we would also propose, and this we actually do in any case, we propose policies to help the people who are hurt by immigration and to maintain or improve their wages. But policies other than restricting immigration. So I'll try to tell you how I'm getting to these conclusions, but this would be completely consistent with how we advise policymakers about trade and about innovation and technical change. Both of these create winners and losers and increase the average income per person. Consistency alone would suggest that if we recommend lots of innovation and no restrictions on that, and trade, no restrictions on that, which we really all do, then the same should be true for immigration. So the only difference possibly is that there are more non-economic considerations with immigration, but people don't ask us about those. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about, first theoretically and then empirically, what actually does happen to the economy when there's immigration. So the first thing is that it's useful to consider a base case of immigration by people who are similar to the native-born population. Now that's not actually usually what happens. Usually the immigrants have some different set of skills from the native-born. But it's very helpful to begin with a case where they're similar. So those of you in economics know that this means that the supply curve shifts out. And so if we didn't think about anything else, you might expect wages to fall. There's more competition for jobs because there's more workers. But the demand curve also shifts out. And so let me take you through that a little bit more because that's what people don't think of so much. So the reason this base case is useful is it's a little bit like thinking of an increase in fertility. Or possibly a cloning. If all the native-born in the US were cloned, you would have double the people, but they would be the exact same distribution of skills. So it's a little like fertility, and like everyone having one more child or something. And so yes, you have more competition for jobs, but you also have more jobs. Why? Because firms will recognize that the population is growing, is about to grow, has grown. They'll have more customers, so they'll need to produce more goods and services. So they'll invest in more capital in anticipation of that. So capital being machines, if it's manufacturing, services, it's probably computers these days, but also other equipment. And in order to run those, they'll also need more workers. So indirectly, the labor demand curve is going to shift out. Okay. And I'll just add that with these extra workers, tax receipts will increase. The government will build more of public goods. And in the end, what we expect is just a bigger economy, more people, more machines, but actually the same wages and prices as before. So we don't normally think that the US must have higher wages than Switzerland because the US is much bigger. And so for the same reason, if immigration simply increased the population without changing its nature, you would expect us to have more of things but no changes in the prices of anything. It's actually important, I think, in some context, to notice that I wrote tax receipts rise and the government builds more schools and hospitals and roads and so forth, because if that actually doesn't happen, so if you have a dysfunctional government, then it may not be true that there's no effect on prices and wages and so forth. If the infrastructure doesn't respond, for example, which is at the moment the case that the US infrastructure is not even being maintained, let alone expanded. Okay, so there's nothing bad has happened here, but nothing good actually has happened either, because everything is just bigger. No native-born gained or lost. The immigrants did gain. They moved to the US or the host country because it was better than the source country. Okay, so now let's consider the more realistic case when there's immigration of immigrants who have some different education profile, for example, from the natives. So in the US, immigrants tend to be concentrated in the very educated categories and in the not very educated at all category. And so what happens then is that you have winners and losers. So in some ways this might be more intuitive. For the people whose characteristics are very similar to those of immigrants, their wages are likely to fall because there they really are just competing. But there's a category of workers of native-born workers that we could call complementary to, say, unskilled immigrants. If you think about the unskilled immigrants to the US, there are some people who are themselves more skilled but work with less skilled workers. And when those less skilled workers become cheaper, there'll be actually more demand not only for them, but for the people they work with who are more skilled. So some natives who work with unskilled people who are increasingly immigrants can actually have their wages increased, and then furthermore firms gain from this because of the low wages of the losers in the process. So let me mention some mechanisms that you might not know about through which the economy does adjust. So one is that when the types of workers available to work to firms changes, they can actually change the set of products that they produce. Another is that they can adopt different technologies depending on what their workforce looks like. And another is that natives may react, particularly if we're thinking about less skilled immigration, in order to avoid competition with immigrants. They may increase their own education. And they may also move to occupations that are more intensive in communication, given that on average immigrants will be likely to speak less good English in most realistic cases. So at the moment I'm generally talking about theory, but actually in this box there's empirical evidence for all of the things in this box. And so these are some of these more complicated mechanisms are some of the reasons why, as I'll tell you in a second, we actually don't find that much effect on the wages of the native born. But remember that, well not remember, there is a net benefit, however, to natives when the immigrants are different. So in fact, the net benefit comes from immigrants being different. So the same characters or the same dimension of immigrants that causes there to be losers, that the immigrants are different from natives, is also what causes there to be, on average, a gain to natives. And one way of thinking about that is that the economy is most efficient when people specialize in things they're best at. And the more diverse in terms of skills your workers are, the more each one can specialize, and the more efficient the economy is, and therefore the size of the total pie, and the size of the pie even for the natives. So the benefit of natives, of immigration, comes when immigrants are different from natives, but so do the distributional issues. Okay, so let me tell you about the empirical results in terms of the impact of immigration on the US. I'll focus on the labor market here with a few other comments. But since we're in the empirical section, let me just show you actually what the US looks like in terms of immigration compared to other countries. So these are all the countries that belong to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They're mostly rich countries, although some are middle income, like Mexico is down here. And on the y-axis, no, I guess I didn't label the y-axis, I'm sorry about that, but the y-axis is the share of the population born abroad. And just look at the blue bars, ignore the white diamonds. This is the OECD average here, and this is the US right here. It's a little bit hard from my angle, but that should look a little bit like 14%. Here at the top, Luxembourg is a bit of an exception. It's sort of a small town, as well as a country. But if you look, there's a whole category of countries that are well above the US, and they're not necessarily New World. So Switzerland, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, but also Austria, Sweden. I guess Israel we don't usually call the New World, but it's sort of the New World. Austria, Sweden, Slovenia, Belgium. So the US is, in shares, only a medium immigration country. Now, of course, as the total, in terms of the total number of immigrants, because the US is so much bigger than the other countries, it receives a big proportion of the immigrants. And until the new administration, that was true also of refugees. So it's very useful to be able to quote a report that came out 2 years ago from the National Academy of Science, a report that brought together, that has authors, a committee composed of academic economists working on immigration, some of them actually from outside the US, who have different views and were asked to write a consensus report on the impact of immigration on the economy. And in terms of the labor market, there was agreement that there's in fact little or no effect of immigration to the US on average wages. Really, no one has found any effect on the employment rate, so the share of people who are employed in the US. That might not be true for some other countries, by the way, but that is for the US. And agreement, however, that immigration to the US, as we've had it with a quite important component of unskilled immigrants, has had a negative effect on the wages of the native-born high school dropouts. So what we did not come to agreement on is how much. So some of us thought not very much, some people thought a lot. It's definitely true that the wages of high school dropouts are fairly low in the US, I think most people would think. So you might think that even a small decrease is very important. Sorry, I went backwards. Now, on the other hand, another thing we reported on that was based in part on my own research was that skilled immigrants increase innovation in the US. So innovation is often measured by patenting, and I showed that patenting per capita goes up when you have more immigrants to the US. And we think that innovation and technological change is a very important driver of economic growth and economic growth per capita. So you might even think that in the long run, this growth would be enough to raise even the wages of the low skilled, although the current low skilled might no longer be working, it might be their children's wages, admittedly, raised. And then there was a whole section of original research in the report looking at what's called the fiscal impact, meaning the taxes paid by immigrants minus things they received from the government. And this report, there's been not very much done on this before because it's a huge undertaking. And it did find that immigrants, on average, subtract from the government budget. But the reason is rather interesting. So that the US doesn't have a very generous welfare system, especially compared to other countries. And so the way in which immigrants are actually costly is that they have more children than natives, and there's a cost to the public school education. So that's actually the big cost of immigrants, educating their children. But depending on your point of view, you could view that actually as an investment rather than a cost. Depends a bit how you view the children of immigrants. Okay, so let's go back to policy. So that was about the theory and the empirics of what the impact is of immigration on the economy. Let's go back to policy again, assuming that there's no way we're just going to say open borders and have done with it. So what criteria should one or should the government take into account? So I'm guided here by things that they tend to take into account, while not necessarily approving of them. So let's just accept that the goal is actually to maximize the welfare of people born in the receiving country, so born in the US. Although even people who favor restrictions on immigration usually make an exception for refugees. So there would be a separate debate about how many refugees we would want to take that I'll not address here. And so the question is, should we pick immigrants who will contribute most to the US? Sometimes people talk about the immigrants needed. Or should we look for immigrants who will assimilate best to the US? And here by assimilation, I'm thinking still on the economic dimension, although the cultural dimension could be interesting too, but I'm thinking in terms of what you earn or your employment rate. And when asking these questions, it's important to know that the immigrant's contribution and their assimilation are not the same thing, although it often sounds like it in the public discourse. So how well the immigrants are doing themselves is not directly correlated with their contribution to the economy. Sometimes the opposite is held as being obvious. And the reason is, remember I said that the economy benefits most when the immigrants are different from the natives. So suppose that all Americans had a master's degree or above, actually the most helpful immigrants would be unskilled immigrants because they would diversify most the workforce. So of course things are a bit more complicated because Americans have all kinds of education, and so do the current immigrants. But one shouldn't think that just the more skilled, the bigger the contribution to the economy, because it's actually the more different, the bigger the contribution to the economy. The exception, of course, is that, as I mentioned, the high-skilled immigrants do this innovation, which has actually particularly long-run benefits through growth that compounds. Okay? But assimilation is mainly measuring how the benefits accruing to the immigrants, not necessarily the natives. But the good thing about assimilation is we can measure it, whereas the contribution, it's very hard to directly measure it. So why would you, are there some reasons why you wouldn't prioritize assimilation? Well, if assimilation is the same thing as being, let's bring in skilled immigrants because they're going to do well, then it might be because you're most worried about the low-skilled natives, that you might call that Rawlsian view, except that because Rawls didn't really seem to care about people abroad. Otherwise, it would be not inconsistent with Rawls's interest in the worst off. Or there could be political reasons. So there is some evidence that politically, skilled immigrants are just more accepted than unskilled immigrants. And I wonder if that's because most people think about the contribution of immigrants mainly in terms of the government budget, so taxes paid and benefits received. I'm not quite sure why it is, but there is some academic research by political scientists showing that skilled immigrants seem to be more acceptable to people in the US and Canada. And certainly the fact that Canada receives very skilled immigrants, which I'm going to come back to, and people really like immigrants there seems consistent. On the other hand, Switzerland has just a few years ago had a kind of a popular resistance emerge to skilled immigrants from the EU. So that seems like a counterexample. Okay, so how could you identify who's going to contribute the most? And again, the short answer is going to be that you can't because we can't really measure it. But let's first talk though about who decides. So that's one issue in immigration policy, is who's actually picking the immigrants. So there's two different decisions to make. One is how many immigrants, and one is, or what's the mix of those immigrants going to be, and who gets to pick them. And so here are the options. So one is, again, open borders, which within, for example, the EU is the case. Okay, so then it's the market and individual migrants who are deciding. The next possibility is firms, and there's actually a fair bit of that in the US system. So for example, the H-1B visa, which is the common entry visa for people who have college or above, those people are chosen by firms. Another big another actor that picks a lot of immigrants are universities. So in the US, many people who study here can't actually stay, but in countries like Australia and Canada, in fact, if you study there, you're easily able to stay on and work. So universities do a lot of picking. And then families, all countries have an important component of family reunification, where you can bring your spouse or your children or your parents, perhaps, if you're already in a country. Okay, and then finally, the one we usually think about, the government, and I'm going to come back to this. So those are the sets of people that typically do decide. Now, who should decide? So in my view, firms are well placed to pick immigrants because that's who is going to be employing the immigrants. They know what is needed, what skills are needed, and where the people are going to be more productive. So I think that firms are well placed to pick people. In some ways, universities are well placed to pick also because then the human capital acquired by the immigrants will be well recognized in the host country. So when people study in the US, then they can get jobs with everyone knowing about what their degree means. Furthermore, of course, in the case of the US has a particularly good higher education system, so they'll have particularly good education. So in some ways, universities are also well placed to do it. There still is the difficulty of how do you pick entrepreneurs, so that it's very hard to have some sort of avenue that allows someone with just an idea to come, say, especially to the US, which is thought to be good for business and startups. How do you know whose idea is good and whose isn't? That's essentially impossible to do. do. So if you don't let entrepreneurs decide themselves, you don't have open borders, it's very hard to know how to pick those people. Okay, so who should not decide, in my view, who comes? Well, one thing that a lot of governments like to do is to pick people based on occupations. And the US has not been doing this. But I'm going to come back to Australia, for example, doing this. And the reason is, so governments think they know what firms need, and they think they know where demand is growing, but it's actually not even possible to work out the latter, where demand is growing, and they don't know nearly as well as firms what firms need. And I also don't think that the government is good at picking, if it picks only skilled people, for the reasons I gave, that unskilled people contribute a lot. Now, the US has not been doing that until now, but in Australia and Canada and New Zealand, there's a big emphasis on letting in skilled people. Now, the only case in which I could be wrong about the contribution of the unskilled is if they're educating their children outweighs all of the benefits that they bring. So that's not something that really can be measured. So when I've been talking about an emphasis in Australia, New Zealand, Canada on letting in skilled people, what I have in mind is their points system. And this is under discussion here a lot, but here it's being called a merit system. Now, a merit system seems inherently very subjective because it implies that you're giving visas to people who deserve it. And there could be many dimensions of why you would deserve a visa. A point system, that's just a sort of descriptive of how it works, but it nearly always, like the proposed merit system here, focuses on people with a lot of education. So the idea is, behind the point system, is first there's almost universally the assumption that the people who contribute the most are skilled, and then you have a set of characteristics, you allocate points to each, and then you prioritize admitting the immigrants with the most points. And this will benefit natives if the skilled immigrants have particularly high positive spillovers, like innovating, which benefits everyone. And if, even though you're focusing on skilled people, they're still pretty different from the natives, because again, the biggest benefits come when the immigrants are different. But, well, I've said this already, you can have even bigger benefits by also admitting unskilled people. And in fact, it turns out though that if you look at Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, they have this point system that prioritizes skilled immigrants, but then it turns out that, oh, actually also they have some other program that lets in unskilled immigrants. So perhaps perhaps there is no government that really believes that only skilled people contribute the most, or perhaps they do believe that, but it's just lobbying by firms for unskilled workers that leads them to also let those in, and perhaps they don't actually believe they contribute much. Okay, so let me tell you a bit about the Canadian system. So sometimes they actually copy things from Australia, but I'm more familiar with the Canadian system from having lived there for quite a while. And furthermore, the Australian one has got so complicated that it's impossible to explain. So I'm going to explain to you a slightly outdated version of the Canadian system, which is being revised in a way that I'm going to tell you. But this is the classic point system. So, and I'm going to describe specifically in a second the Anglophone Canada system. Quebec has its own one. So the idea is that you give points to people that you think are going to earn a lot, and there's actually a threshold which in principle will be changed each year. In Canada for a long time it wasn't changed. In Australia they change it more often. And you admit those beyond the threshold. And actually the way these systems work is when you're admitted on the point system, you actually get permanent residence. So you could imagine one where there's a point system and you only get a temporary visa, and then there's some other set of rules about who gets permanent residence. Actually, Australia now has those as well. Okay? And so here's what the point allocation was for a long time. So the maximum was 100, and for a long time you had to get 67 to get in. So there were 25 points based on your education. So the amount, actually, not quality or type. And there were 28 points for having mastery of the English and or French languages people would do. Then you had 15 points for the amount of experience you had in the occupation you said you were currently exercising. There are 12 points for being not too old. In the Anglophone system in Quebec, you're allowed to be old. But in Australia, for example, for over 45, it's basically you can't get in on the point system. And Anglophone Canada, it wasn't that you couldn't get in, but you got points off for being too old. And 10 points, and this is important actually, if you had a job offer in Canada already, but only 10 out of 100. And then 10 for some other things, like you could get points for you had family in Canada already, even under the skilled system. So what was the effect? This has been studied extensively in Canada. What's the effect of this system? So this may seem too obvious to study, but it's actually not. When they reallocated more points to education, they did in fact admit immigrants with more education. So if that weren't true, the policy would be in trouble. So you want to first check that that was actually true, so it was. And in fact, in Canada now, since these 10 or 15 years, most immigrants, in fact, have a college degree or more. So certainly the system has led to very educated people going to Canada. I also find that the more points you have, so amongst the people who arrive, some have more points than others, the more points the people had, the more they actually did earn. So we're measuring assimilation here as usual, because that's something that you can measure, unlike the contribution. And they're also more likely to be employed, which is slightly more of a concern in Canada, which has had a higher unemployment rate generally than the US. And immigrants that came in under the point system also earn more than immigrants who came in either through a family reunification or through one of these less skilled worker programs. Okay, so that's all good. But that's a narrow assessment of the success of the program, because there are quite a few indications that that system didn't maximize the benefits of immigrants, or didn't maximize even how well they assimilated or performed in the labor market. And so what are these indications? Well, one is the immigrants have this great education, but it hasn't translated into the kind of earnings you would expect if you compare with natives, which I didn't on the previous slide. So in particular, Canadian immigrants with a college degree tend to earn the same as native born with a high school degree. So that the college immigrants are getting high school wages. And in the US, that's not true. So the US college immigrants get college wages. And there is a big variation. There are some very fully paid college immigrants in the US, but on average, they look kind of like college native born. Okay. Also, interestingly, unlike in the US, the immigrants, skilled immigrants, don't actually increase innovation and patent tech. Now, perhaps that's not to do with the immigration system, perhaps it is, but what you find is that unlike in the US where immigrants disproportionately work in science and engineering, in Canada they don't, and in fact even many that entered having previously worked in science and engineering move into another field. And in my view, what this old system reflected and these poor performances reflected was a lack of role for employers in deciding who was admitted, and I think they're just bad matches between employer and worker, that matches that didn't maximize the productivity of people. Now, it turns out that actually other people agreed, and at the beginning I believe with New Zealand, and then Australia, and now also Anglophone Canada, a new system's been introduced that still has points, but it's different in important ways. So what they do now is something that increases the role of the employer considerably. So the government still picks out a set of applicants who exceed the points threshold, but then they sort of put up their files online. Employers look at them and they can pick out someone they want to hire. Now, surely in many of these cases that was already arranged in advance, so many people would already have their offer from the employer. employer and they would just go through the system. But other people would perhaps not have a job yet lined up before they applied. Then they go into this pool, they can be picked out by an employer, and if they are, then those people are at the head of the line to be admitted to Canada, even if they had lower points than someone else who didn't attract an employer's attention or job offer. So in my view, this is a big improvement. It's a bit too early yet to know what to have empirical evidence on how the new immigrants accepted it are doing. Okay, so there's still a few things in these systems that I don't like. There's some people, especially people who wrote policies, disagree with me. So in Australia especially, but Australia will only accept immigrants in shortage occupations, apart from the fact that there's conceptually not such a thing as a shortage occupation. It's not, even labor economists have difficulty identifying what the occupations are where demand is increasing. So I think that's something that government's very bad at. In Canada and Australia, you're more likely to get in if you agree to go to some obscure location that no natives want to live in. So, for example, the Maritime Provinces in Canada have had an immigration boom since this came in. So they're very excited because all the natives have moved elsewhere. No one who has to live in the Atlantic provinces actually lives there because there are no jobs. And in Australia, well, actually, in Australia, you have obscure, very hot places. In Canada, you have obscure, very cold places. So comparing systems and still basing it on assimilation or the success of immigrants, what people have found is, and this is amongst places with point systems, that immigrants do better in Australia than in Canada. And interestingly, a lot of this is because of something Australia introduced in 1999, which is English exams. And so it's known that, knowing the language of the country you're going to, so in the US in particular, the better you know English, not only the higher your wages, but the more they grow over time. It's really a big advantage. And so making people pass English exams has really increased the earnings of people in Australia. Although interestingly, not because people who applied did crash English courses and you got the same people with better English. It actually shifted the pool of applicants and people, it shifted the countries that people came from. So more from India, for example. Now there's a number of differences in how immigrants do in Australia and in the US. For example, in Australia they have trouble finding jobs and employment is quite a big issue. In the US the issues are all related to wages. And it turns out though that a lot of the differences between Australia and the US to do with the mix of origin countries, which is probably to do with geography. So obviously there's going to be many Mexicans in the US and hardly any Mexicans in Australia, for example. And it seems as though origin countries, sort of independent of any visa system, are very important. And so less of the difference between Australia and the US is to do with the immigration system than you might think. And then furthermore, the labor markets are rather different. So Australia has more unemployment, and that's also relevant. Now, another important thing to remember is people talk about countries with a point system as though everyone who goes there is under the point system, and that's not true at all. So the impact of, say, a merit system in the US would completely depend on how many people were coming through that system. And just one thing to think about is usually there's some main applicant for a family. I mean, of course, many immigrants are single, but many of them are married. Are you also evaluating the spouse? Because if you're not, then already only about half of the people are actually coming through the points-based system, and less people, and they do tend to marry people very similar to themselves, but that depends on the country. You might want to think also, as I mentioned, about whether your system is conferring temporary visas or permanent visas. Okay. Just to give you a flavor, obviously don't have time to run through every possible immigration system, but there was a book written by Pio Renius and Madeline Zawotny that included in it something that many economists love. So economists really love auctions. They like selling things by auction because then the people who most want them are the ones who will get them. And so it's natural that economists have had the great idea of why not auction visas. So that doesn't get at the question of how many to have, but it does mean that the government will get the most possible money. So there are fees already for applying for the visas, but this way the government will get more money, and they'll go to the companies, for example, who want them the most. So that's an important element of the Arrhenius-Zavodny proposal. But before that, so they recognized, because they're economists, that the government wouldn't want to admit only skilled. And so in their proposal, the government somehow has to decide how many skilled and unskilled they want. So although there's going to be a big market element here, the first step is the government has to decide something which it's not going to know how to do. So there's going to be some distribution of immigrants by education. Within those categories, the firms will bid for the visas. And then they could also resell the visa then later to another company. So there would be a market for visas, in other words. But their proposal doesn't give any guide to what the total number should be, how it should be. It's giving some guidance about the education levels, and it's saying it shouldn't only be the skilled. But how do you go into the details? It's difficult for economists to give guidance on that. Okay, so just a few concluding thoughts. One is that immigration policy, as currently practiced, is not really based on economics in two senses. The details are not worked out by economists, but part of the reason for that is that economists have less to help you with than you would think on the details, as long as we're not talking about open borders, in which case there wouldn't be any actual policy to work out. And again, I think that recommending open borders would be consistent with what we're doing on trade and innovation. And of course, if you argue we're wrong about trade and innovation as well, then we could be wrong about immigration. But it's important to remember that any immigration policy is inherently subjective. Even just focusing on economics, you have to put weights on people and say how much are you upset if the low-wage workers lose compared to the gains of other people. And we don't have any particular insight, economists, into how you should weight people. But we can point out factors such as reminding people that low-skilled people do in fact contribute to the economy, and the empirical result that in the US immigration does not in fact reduce average native-born wages. So it's not just that workers are losing, firms are gaining. On average, it's a wash for workers and the firms are gaining. Okay. And then remember that immigration increases innovation and growth, presumably more from the skilled. But this does raise the possibility that in the long run, everyone does gain, but we don't know how the long run is. And then I emphasize, as I did at the beginning, that there are other policies we could do to compensate low-wage workers who are affected by immigration other than cutting immigration. So we should be working on education systems and other things, including probably expanding the income tax credit, policies like that, to help the less skilled workers. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Please go ahead and pose questions for Dr. Hunt. I'll repeat them so that they can be heard by our audience that's going to be watching this on video, and then Professor Hunt will respond. She'll recognize the...
Okay, I think we're the first.
What was the most frustrating thing about working in the government as an economist?
The question was, what is the most frustrating thing about working in the government as an economist?
You know, I have to admit that it really occurred to me that if we did a massive education campaign so that everyone knew about supply and demand curves, that would be really, really beneficial. So I would say that particularly with immigration, I encountered a lot of non-economists who lived in some parallel economic universe that didn't involve supply and demand curves, and so it was just hard to communicate. But you asked me to point out a frustrating aspect. In general, I had a very good experience in government, but there is sometimes a communication problem, and I don't know if frustrating is the right word for this, but other people have noticed that economists who serve the government tend to be viewed as the skunk at the garden party, because we can always think of some negative side effect or overlooked disadvantage of the policy that even policies proposed by well-meaning people with whose objectives we agree. Yeah, you're the yes.
In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned specialization for certain occupations when immigrants come into the country. If a lot of low-skilled immigrants come into the country, is it worth it to specialize in some of the production that they would be best at? So like textile production, which the United States really, can't specialize in because they don't have necessarily the comparative advantage. So is it worth specializing in those aspects of production when dealing with low-skilled immigration?
The question was about whether when low-skilled immigrants enter in the United States, that would be appropriate to lead to low-tech industries or industries that intensively employ low-skilled workers, given the lack of U.S. comparative advantage in that area.
So empirical work that's looked at the degree to which immigration shifts the spectrum of products and services provided hasn't found that much effect. So theoretically, we really expect that to happen. Empirically, we found more evidence for producing the same things but with a different technology that's complementary to less skilled workers, or at least specifically the papers have looked at the technology adoption as a function of the share of less skilled workers as influenced by immigrants. And there has been more evidence of that. I will say though, although this is a bit more anecdotal, if you just go to Europe and travel, you'll find that there are things that actually, services that just don't exist there because the immigrants are not as unskilled. So for example, you can't find anyone to carry your bags for you in Europe, which you can in the US, and that's a trivial example. No one shines shoes in Europe. So you can anecdotally see though that there are actually some of these things. Now these services that exist here, not in Europe because of the unskilled immigrants, tend to be ones that are consumed by better off people. So I mean, poor natives don't have their shoes shined by poor immigrants. It's better off natives who do that. So that just sort of reinforces sort of a redistributive issue, the problem with immigration. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering about the empirical data about the impact on wages of high school dropouts that get a GED, the information on that.
The question is about whether there is empirical data on the high school dropouts' wages, people who drop out of high school but then complete GEDs, general code C diplomas.
What's been found about people who get GEDs is that it increases their likelihood of going to college, obviously, because otherwise they couldn't have. And so those people do well. But people who get a GED only tend to have high school dropout wages. And so although there actually has been no study of the effect of immigrants on GED completers, I would think it would split exactly that way, that if they didn't go to college, that they would be hurt like the high school dropouts. If they did go to college, it would be a completely different thing, that they potentially could even be helped in terms of wages.
If everyone had open borders, wouldn't it affect more some countries more negatively?
The question is whether if there were open borders, the effects would be more negative on some countries than others.
I could answer both ways, but are you thinking of receiving countries or sending countries? Well, I'll try and answer both ways. So I mean, perhaps this is a good time to talk about some exceptions to what I said about benefits of immigration. So suppose that you are an agricultural, a country where agriculture is an important employer, and you're already farming most of your land. Then you can think of land as being kind of a fixed factor, and when immigrants come, there's going to be crowding, unlike when I said that capital would increase because there's more people. Let's say your land can't increase. Then the natives would be hurt. I can't actually think of any country like that that's receiving a lot of immigrants, although there's some that I don't know too well about. So for example, I think Côte d'Ivoire has a lot of immigrants from Burkina Faso. I don't know if that would be such a case or not. I've lost my train of thought.
Sending countries.
Yeah, I wasn't quite going to get onto the sending countries yet, but for sending countries, the free borders is good for the original population of the sending countries, but that doesn't guarantee that the people left behind will be better off. So there's actually a lot of research on brain drain. So initially, people thought that the people left behind would be worse off because the best people would leave. Now people have a more nuanced view because sometimes those best people leave but then go back and perhaps help the home country even more than if they'd never left. So that's actually unclear. Oh, I know what the thought was I was going to go back to before. So I was going to repeat what I said about if you have a lot of immigration and your government is incompetent, that can be a problem because the government needs to supply some goods, and some of those goods need to have more spending when there's more people. It should be funded by more taxes from the immigrants, but if the government is just not able to supply those, and I'll include in there actually housing. So a thing that people, a lot of natives talk about, I think of somewhere like Vancouver especially, who feel that the immigration has been negative is because it's been increasing housing prices. And so increased housing prices may be inevitable if there's only so much space, although you could perhaps build higher and higher skyscrapers. But in many places, though, the reason that the housing stock is essentially fixed is because of policies that prevent it from expanding. And those are usually not national policies, those are usually local policies. And in the US, San Francisco would be the classic example of this. You can look at a photo of it from the air, and you can see that other than a few skyscrapers downtown, they're sort of individual houses with gardens. And you can see why this is again a question of winners and losers. If you have one of those houses, you want all your neighbors to keep having those houses, and perhaps you're opposed to a policy that would allow construction of multi-story buildings there. But that's a policy that's necessary for what I said about immigration being beneficial to be true. So there are several things that need to be true for immigration to be as beneficial as it could be. That doesn't exactly answer your question, but ask a follow-up question if you want.
As of this moment, immigration policy is pretty controversial. Could you give some insight on what you believe will happen in regards to U.S. immigration policy in the near future?
Well,
sorry, if I could repeat the question. So the questioner pointed out that there are some controversial aspects to the proposed policy here, and wonders how this is reflected in, I think, current U.S. debates.
Well, so the question is what will happen to policy in the future? Well, judging by the past since 1986, I would say nothing. At least nothing that Congress will agree on. And so both this administration and the previous administration made some changes through executive orders which change regulations, but there's a lot of things, it sort of changed, well, we're seeing that it can change more than we thought perhaps, or the courts will decide, but it can't really, executive orders can't affect really fundamental change in immigration. And the Congress just doesn't seem to be able to agree on anything, although the reform I worked on in 2013 actually passed the Senate, and many people thought it would pass the House of Representatives, but Mitch McConnell wouldn't actually allow a vote on it. So that's actually different from saying that Congress can't agree. Congress might in fact have agreed, but they weren't given the opportunity to. to, but there just seems to be that was a real compromise package in 2013 that had dimensions to please everybody and still it didn't pass. So in terms of legislation, I can't see actually a lot of change, but eventually something must change. But I wouldn't like to predict when or exactly how. Yeah, let's go to the.
Yes, you mentioned the 2017 study indicating that the immediate fiscal impact of immigration might be negative. Of course, the immediate fiscal impact of having children is probably negative for natives. What time period did that study cover, and is there a time period by which you could make a net present value calculation as to what the ultimate impact would be?
Question asks, what time frame the 2017 study that identified an immediate negative fiscal impact of immigrants would cover, and over what time frame it might become positive?
So the people working on that part of the report tried to do two things. One is just if you're looking at right now, but right now was, I think, 2014. You're looking at right now, who is contributing what, and does it look like it's a net positive or negative for immigrants? That's a lot easier to do, but in some ways not so meaningful, because one reason why, despite what I said that the immigrants look pretty good on contributing, is that not many of them are retired. Because of this change that was mentioned, the 1965 Legislative Act, that was, until that point, for some decades, there had been little immigration, which means that the immigrants who've been coming since then, mostly have not got to retirement age, and when you subtract most is actually at the beginning when you're being educated for public school and at the end when you're retired. So you naturally want to ask, right, if the immigrants are all contributing lots in taxes now, but what about projecting into the future when they're going to be retired? Well, it turns out that this is well known that even predicting the past is rather difficult for economists, and predicting the future is very difficult. So they did it, but the number of assumptions we need to make is actually so huge. I mean, just for one thing, it involves predicting what the budget deficit is going to be of the government out into the future. I mean, that a lot of you know, you have no idea, because that's not even actually an economic parameter. So I would say that it's I would actually say it's basically impossible to predict into the future. And you also have to predict what's going to happen to immigration in the future, the new immigrants. It's one thing to predict how the current ones are going to age and work, but if there's some big change in immigration policy, then that's also going to throw those out the window.
In your research, did you find that there was a specific demographic of immigrants that made up a large portion of the skilled workers? And if so, what was their origin?
Question is, did you find what a particular demographic of immigrants that contributed a larger proportion of skilled workers, and if so, what was it?
I'm just trying to kind of load facts into my mind here. I mean, it does tend to be the case that the richer the origin country, the more the person earns in the US. That's not exactly, well, it's sort of a demographic. There are different groups. Every country though has a big variety of people. So we usually think, for example, of Mexicans as being not so skilled and they aren't on average. But there's actually a huge number of college-educated Mexicans in the U.S. as well. So it's very hard to generalize. But on the whole, though, Mexicans have been amongst big groups have been earning less, and Europeans, for example, or people from English-speaking countries tend to do well, but Indians, for example, do well. So, yeah, and that's not because India on average is well educated. So Europeans do well here because Europeans also in Europe are well educated. And in the Indian case, it's because it's very specific Indians who come to the US.
You mentioned earlier that an immigration of workers who are roughly equally skilled with the natives will lead to no net gain or loss for the natives if everything is managed properly by the government. if it were not managed properly, would that allow for a gain for the natives or only a loss?
Question addresses the presentation about the no net gain for natives if immigrants are the same types of people. The question is, how would that change if the government weren't adequately providing public services?
I think that's particularly going to reduce the benefits to the people benefiting. So firms, for example, they need infrastructure in order to do business. If they can't expand and ship their goods around or use broadband, internet, that kind of thing, then the benefits to them will be a lot less. I think that's the way I would think about it the most. But if you think about housing, then the losses to the people who lose would be bigger as well if housing prices are going up a lot, for example.
Okay, we'll have time for one more question.
Thank you. I'm curious about the terminology of native and non-native. How many generations or how many years or how many whatevers does it take before a person is categorized as a native, not an immigrant?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So one of the reasons that I said native versus non-native is I'm reflecting the academic literature which thinks that term is clear, that native means you were literally born in the place, and non-native doesn't. That's something you can usually see in the census in particular, which is why people often use it. Although sometimes people say, all right, if you arrived in the US when you were young, that's basically the same as being born here. So when we're studying immigrants, let's look at people who arrived when they were over 18 or something like that. But most of the academic literature is just on when you were born, partly for data reasons. But it's useful to know, another reason to avoid the immigrant term is that, for example, for the government, you could be living here and born somewhere else. You could have arrived yesterday to the US and you wouldn't be called an immigrant because you have a temporary visa. For the government, immigrants are only people who have green cards. Those are immigrant visas, and temporary work visas, those holders are not considered by the government to be called immigrants. So everyone has their own terminology. But there is a literature, though, that looks specifically at children of immigrants, and then that is often divided into, well, did you come when you were 2? Oh, sorry, those would still be immigrants. But children of immigrants, and how different groups doing over generations. That's a separate literature.
All right, well, thank you very much for those questions.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Hunt, and thank you all for coming. Just one brief announcement. We welcome you all to come to our next event, which will be on Monday, October 14th. It'll be back at Little Theater at 4:30 p.m. And this, our very own President Massetti will actually be on that panel discussion with his 2 co-authors, Professor Charles Holden of St. Mary's College in Maryland and Professor Julie Cordair of Lawrence University. They will discuss their forthcoming book, Republican Populist, Spiro Agnew, and the Origins of Donald Trump's Americas. We hope you can join us all again then. Thank you again.